Our next speaker, Mr. Speaker, tonight is Brian Mast from Florida. I got to know Brian when he was running for this office, got to go down and visit with him in his district as he was running. And let me just say, many times we talk about elections being, you know, with campaign ads and speeches and all of those kind of things are very true. But it's also when a person connects with the people that they're representing. When he connects with them, and they connect with them in such a way that it sort of even transcends their ideological perspective. And I remember a story, and I want to tell just before I yield. We were at a polling precinct, and we were holding signs. People were early voting. And I remember this one lady got out. She parked her car, got out, got her young child out, came up to Brian and said, "I'm a Democrat from across," and he said, "I'm voting for everybody else." She said, "But I'm voting for you, and I wanted my daughter to meet you." When you make that kind of connection, that is what makes America great. That's the connection that people need to have with their federal government. That's why the People's House is such a special place to be, and the People's House has a special representative from Florida. And I yield now to Brian Mast from Florida's 18th Congressional District.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for putting me in this special order together tonight, for yielding me the time, and you know, for becoming a friend of mine, coming down and joining me in the beautiful 18th Congressional District of Florida. Mr. Speaker, it is with tremendous honor and humility that I rise to represent the hardworking values of the 18th Congressional District of Florida, with communities like Palm Beach Gardens, home of the PGA Tour, Stuart, Florida, home to the U.S. Sailing Academy, Port St. Lucie, the spring training home of the New York Mets, and Fort Pierce, Florida, the home of the only Navy SEAL and UDT museum in the entire country. It's truly, it's an amazing place for anybody to go to. And before I go any further, I do want to do this as well, Mr. Speaker. I know I am joined by the rest of my freshman colleagues and probably everybody in this chamber here, the entire body, when I say that our thoughts and our prayers today have been with our new colleague, Mr. Rutherford from the 4th District of Florida, as I call him, the sheriff. He's a friend and he's a patriot, and I know that we're all praying for his speedy recovery. As I talk to people in my community, there is one issue that keeps them up at night more than any other issue, and that issue is the water quality in our area, or rather the lack thereof. I can tell you that it is non-negotiable. It is a non-negotiable priority for me that we allow the water in our community, water that used to be so blue that it looked like something out of a postcard, to once again become clean for this generation, for future generations. While I was studying at Harvard, I studied the environment, and I did very specific work in watershed infrastructure. But I can tell you that it doesn't take an academic to know that these waterways are irreplaceable treasures, to know that they're central to the economy and the quality of life in our region. And it's why most people I know make our 18th district home, why they call this place someplace that they want to live for the rest of their life. It's the water and it's the weather. And to tell you the truth, in Florida, if you take the water away, the weather isn't always that comfortable. But right now, there is water being discharged from the center of our state, Lake Okeechobee, into the Treasure Coast of Florida, destroying our community, putting our people out of business, killing sea life, and making people sick. What makes our communities so beautiful is literally being robbed from us. And this cannot continue. Our lagoon, our beaches, our estuaries, they have to be restored, and I will work endlessly to strengthen the partnership between our local, state, and federal agencies to upgrade that infrastructure. Not just talk about it, but actually get it done, because this is life or death for the community that I represent. Mr. Speaker, if I sound heated over this, it's because I am heated over this. When I look back at history and see that the Panama Canal took less than a decade to build once the United States government got involved, that the Hoover Dam was built in over 5 years. As far as I can tell, construction technology has only improved since the 1930s, but the infrastructure restoration surrounding Lake Okeechobee and the Florida Everglades is taking decades. It's an absolute embarrassment that the water infrastructure projects in Florida are taking so long and at such a great social and economic cost to communities like my own. We can't afford to wait any longer. and this will be my top priority. Another issue that I hear about constantly is from people in our community talking about that the role of America's weak foreign policy over the last 8 years has played in destabilizing the Middle East and making our country and communities, places like Fort Pierce, where the terrorist who attacked the Orlando nightclub lived, where he worshiped, making our country less safe. As a member of Congress, I will work every day to provide the men and women of our armed services with the tools and the flexibility that they need to do their job and to come home alive. When I was serving in the Army, I had the honor to work alongside the best men and women that I've ever known. I worked as a bomb technician in our highest level of military special operations. And under the cover of darkness in Afghanistan, our job was to kill or capture the most menacing targets each and every night that we could find. I witnessed firsthand the extremists that want to literally destroy our way of life. My scars and the scars of my fellow veterans and peers, they should be a continual reminder of the enemy that we're fighting and why the work that we're doing is so important. For me, on September 19th, 2010, I found my last explosive device. And it wasn't that much different from so many others that have claimed the lives of friends of mine. It was homemade explosives, encapsulated in pieces of glass and nails, ball bearings, shrapnel. It was meant to detonate whenever it was stepped on. Mr. Speaker, the people that put that bomb there, that manufactured that device, who have killed or wounded our bravest men and women, their goal is to wipe our country and our allies off the face of this earth, to bring that same war to our hometowns, as they have done in so many places already, places like New York and Boston and Chattanooga, San Bernardino, Fort Hood and Orlando. 8 years of failed international leadership has created a vacuum of power that's being filled by ISIS and other terrorist groups. ISIS right now has more money, more land, more resources than Al-Qaeda did at 9/11. Sitting back and waiting for peace, that's not a strategy. Containment, that's not a strategy. We need aggressive strategy to root out extremists, eliminate any safe haven to prevent future attacks on the United States of America. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I am as well aware as anybody that defeating those who come against us out of our hatred, it comes at a cost. Friends of mine, too many friends of mine, have lost 3 or 4 limbs, have been blinded, have been covered on their entire body with burns, have had massive head trauma, or some combination of all of the above injuries. Sadly, I'm also aware of how often the VA fails these men and women. And I can tell you that it is not an option. We have to do better. We owe our veterans better than the care that they're getting right now. Improving care for our veterans, it starts with reforming the Department of Veterans Affairs. I strongly believe that the best way to do this is to give veterans the flexibility to choose anytime, anywhere medical care. The increased competition will force the Department of Veterans Affairs to provide a higher quality of care to our servicemen and women. Beyond this, we have to eliminate the corruption and the incompetence at the Department of Veterans Affairs to reduce the claims backlog currently plaguing the VA hospitals across the country. These pending claims make it nearly impossible for the men and women who fought in places like Iwo Jima, the Chosin Reservoir, Saigon, Mogadishu, Kandahar, Mosul, and any other places to live their life, as they have to wait years for a decision from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Fixing these problems, it will ensure that the future generations of servicemen and women are not burdened with the same challenges that today's veterans are facing. In addition to physical health care, we have to do more to help veterans with mental health care. There's a stat that's thrown around all too often that there are more than 20 veterans a day that take their own life. I've known some of them. I could tell you how that's an unacceptable rate that far exceeds the average of the civilian population. But the fact is, to lose just one veteran from suicide is completely unacceptable. This is very personal to me. I've seen firsthand the impact that war can have on soldiers returning home, all of whom daily work through the trauma of having friends who they're forced to remember who didn't come home with them. Not a week goes by where I don't get a call from someone who wants to talk about the fact that they want to step in front of a bus or go to sleep in their garage with the car running and never wake up. Often this call comes after a traumatizing experience that they've just had at the Department of Veterans Affairs. We need to be there for one another, and we need to be there for our veterans. I think often about something that President Kennedy once said. He said that the cost of freedom has always been high, but Americans have always been willing to pay that price. Our veterans, they do pay that price. They make tremendous personal sacrifices. But just because they're always going to be there, and they're always willing to make these sacrifices for our freedom, that doesn't mean that we can take their service for granted, which is exactly what is happening every single time one of our veterans has failed. I'm committed to doing all that I can to increase mental health resources for our veterans, and doing anything I can, whether that's legislative or personally, to reduce veteran suicide rates. But we also have to do more to assist returning veterans in finding jobs and starting new careers once they do exit the military. I know that the men and women that I served with were among the most talented and hardworking men and women that I've ever met in this entire world. Veterans know what it's like to work in high-pressure situations, to be held to a standard of excellence. They know the stress of loading their body down with hundreds of pounds of equipment and trekking that across long distances to work together as a team. They know what it takes to go out there and get the job done no matter what challenge is placed in front of them. And they know what it is to not just risk the bottom line, but to actually go out there and put their own life on the line. Veterans are among the most qualified employees for any position. But veterans returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan, they face an unemployment rate that is substantially higher than the national average. And I'm committed to working with local businesses and community leaders to discuss ways to reverse this troubling trend, as well as supporting legislation that will help our veterans use the very unique skills and talents that they've developed for the rest of their life. Mr. Speaker, following my service in the U.S. Army, I made a very conscious choice to volunteer with the Israeli Defense Forces because our countries share common ideals of freedom and democracy and mutual respect for all people, something that I know firsthand is not common in most of the Middle East. During my time in Israel, I served alongside soldiers driven by love for their fellow man rather than by hatred for their neighbors. I learned with each family that I got to know just how much each family truly desires peace with every neighbor of Israel, regardless of their religion or their history with those countries. The same cannot be said of Israel's enemies. For the United States, the choice is very clear. We either stand with a historic friend and ally who shares our values, or we cave to groups like the Palestinians or countries like Iran, who represent everything that the United States is not. I have found that the most important time to stand for what is right is when it's the most difficult time to stand for what is right. This moment in history is no different. We have to be proud of who we are, and we have to stand with those who stand with us and stand against any terrorist regime who seeks to threaten even one of us. Mr. Speaker, the last thing that I want to say tonight is simply that it is a tremendous honor to have the opportunity to serve the people of Florida's 18th Congressional District. I know very well that the office that I occupy, it doesn't truly belong to me. It belongs to those people. And the simple fact is that the status quo has not been good enough for them. Families across the country, They're hurting, and I know that we have a lot of work to do. I've laid out a number of priorities to help the 18th District and to strengthen our country, but I also know this, that the problems Washington, D.C. is facing, they cannot just be fixed with bills and laws. One of the most important lessons that I ever learned in the military, that I ever learned in combat, was that inspiration matters. Military leaders that I had who displayed courage and valor and selflessness, they drew the exact same thing out of every single soldier that surrounded them. And that's my goal as I'm here in the halls of Congress, every day that I work to, above all, inspire each peer that I have here, Republican and Democrat, to have courage and to make sure that their sense of duty is to America above anything else, and to make sure that we serve selflessly, and that every day that we're given the honor to serve here, to make this country and our communities that much better. And with that, I yield back any time that I have remaining.